Hi everyone, I'm really pleased to be here this afternoon to present to you the new ESO Guideline on aphasia rehabilitation on behalf of the wider multidisciplinary and international working group. I'd also, like Marguerite, like to acknowledge the great support we've had from ESO Secretariat, Yvonne Brucher, and the ESO Guidelines Committee, Jan Pruger. So as you know, aphasia affects about a third of the stroke population, but what may be less evident to you is that in comparison to stroke survivors without aphasia, people with aphasia experience poorer functional outcomes, poorer psychosocial outcomes, reduced well-being, they receive less pain medication, they are screened less for continence issues, fewer return home or to work, compared to people who've had a stroke and no aphasia. And this is in the context of greater rehabilitation resource use. So effective aphasia rehabilitation is an absolute clinical priority, not just in relation to communication rehabilitation, but in terms of rehabilitation more generally. So anecdotally, we know that there's a huge variation in terms of speech and language therapy provision within the UK, where I'm based, or internationally. And we wanted to capture this through some more rigorous approach. And so we looked at a systematic review of published randomized controlled trials of speech and language therapy for aphasia since 2012. And we looked at the usual care arms of those trials, where speech and language therapy provision in the usual care arms ranged from anything from 15 minutes per week up to 15 hours, from 4 hours total dose of speech and language therapy to 100 speech and language therapy hours, anything from 1 week of therapy up to 52 weeks of therapy in terms of duration of therapy. And then in the number of days per week that you received some speech and language therapy could range from 0 sessions up to 5 days per week. So as a working group, we were working from this background where we felt that this was really unacceptable. And it feels very much in line with the Action Plan for Stroke in Europe 2018 to 2030, where there's a call to develop evidence-based results on timing, level and type of intervention, and particularly to look at more effective management of post-stroke language impairment. Many large randomized controlled trials in this field have been emerging since that time, including FCET2EC from Germany, Telerehabilitation from Norway, and Compare and Verse from Australia. And in addition, we've had a large individual participant data network meta-analysis that was based on just under 6,000 individual participants' data from stroke contexts, which explore the importance of speech and language therapy frequency as measured in days of therapy per week, the intensity of therapy provided measured in therapy hours per week, and the total dose of therapy, which was the number of SLT hours delivered across the entire SLT rehabilitation program. And the findings, or some of the findings from that large piece of work, suggested that there was very clear evidence of a critical therapeutic range. So, as a consequence, the ESO Guideline Committee identified aphasia rehabilitation as a priority guideline, and myself and my co-chair, Katerina Hillary, we set about to create a large working group and followed standard operating procedures. We used the GRADE framework and we updated relevant evidence synthesis to inform our aphasia rehabilitation guideline. Across our working group, we discussed our PICOs and identified 10 relevant PICOs relating to SLT dose, intensity and frequency, and relating to the delivery of therapy. We looked at group versus one-to-one speech language therapy, digital versus in-person therapy, tailored interventions by functional relevance and level of language difficulty versus non-tailored approaches. And we also looked at brain stimulation with SLT for aphasia and compared to sham interventions. Following a Delphi approach, our working group identified these as all highly critically relevant outcomes. Far too many to present to you today, but they are in that guideline. I'll be focusing on the post-intervention time point, looking at function, communication and quality of life where that evidence was available. We graded strength of recommendation using high, moderate, low and very low, which was standard across all of the ESO guidelines. We updated a large systematic review from Cochrane in 2016, which informed all but one of our PICOs. And so as a consequence of that searching, we identified just over 4,000 references, and filtering through to identify relevant trials and drawing the relevant trials from the existing Cochrane review, we ended up with 28 randomized controlled trials. In relation to brain stimulation, we conducted a separate systematic search because that built on an alternative Cochrane review, and that search dated from 2018. We identified just over 800 relevant references, and together with the trials identified in that searching and the trials that had been identified from the original Cochrane review, we identified 17 randomized trials informing that TDCS comparison. So for each PICO, we looked at risk of bias. This is the way it's presented in the guideline, and you'll see D3 is particularly high risk, which is the blinding of the individual and the people delivering the intervention to the intervention. But in many rehabilitation trials, it's really difficult to actually blind the individual to receiving speech and language therapy or not. So for speed and efficiency, I have mapped these risk of bias to the right-hand side of the meta-synthesis here. So in relation to looking at higher dose of SLT, which we defined as at least 20 hours of speech and language therapy compared to a lower dose, we looked across all of those outcome measures, and this was the evidence as it related to functional communication, which is not quite significant, but you can see that we've got a couple of trials there that favour the delivery of high-dose intervention on measures of functional communication. On measures of quality of life, the people who had received the higher dose intervention performed significantly better than those that received the lower dose. So our recommendation was that in people with aphasia post-stroke, we recommend high-dose SLT interventions at or above 20 hours of therapy rather than lower dose should be offered. Our second PICO looked at higher intensity SLT, defined as at least 3 hours per week of therapy compared to lower intensities. This is the evidence as related to functional communication, where we saw that the people who had received higher intensity interventions performed significantly better on measures of functional communication than those that had received lower intensity interventions. Quality of life did not demonstrate the same gains, and our recommendation was that in people with aphasia post-stroke, we suggest high-intensity SLT of at least 3 hours of therapy per week rather than lower intensity should be offered. PICO 3 looked at the frequency of speech and language therapy, which we defined as high frequency if it was at or above 4 days per week, compared to lower frequency SLT of less than 4 days per week. On measures of functional communication, we saw no evidence of a difference, and we also did not observe evidence of a difference on measures of quality of life, although it was approaching significance. But based on all the other outcome measures, we concluded with the recommendation that in people with aphasia post-stroke, we suggest high-frequency SLT should be offered rather than low-frequency SLT. We looked at the delivery formats, delivery models of speech and language therapy for aphasia and digitally delivered SLT, such as telerehabilitation, using a virtual reality therapist or similar interventions, and we compare those to usual in-person, face-to-face interventions. This was the evidence as it related to functional communication. We were interested if there was any evidence or any suggestion that there was a difference between these two kinds of interventions. There was no measure of quality of life. And our recommendation in relation to this PICO was that in people with aphasia after stroke, we suggest using either in-person or digitally delivered SLT. In people with aphasia after stroke, we wanted to know whether in-person SLT, in addition to digital therapy, so a digital augmentation, using computer software, tablet-based software, virtual reality, whether that was better than usual in-person, face-to-face therapy alone. This was the evidence relating to functional communication. There was no measure relating to quality of life. And we concluded that in people with aphasia after stroke, we suggested in-person SLT plus digital augmentation should be offered rather than usual in-person SLT alone. So we looked at group speech and language therapy compared to one-to-one SLT, and we asked whether it was associated with similar improvements. This is the data relating to functional communication. Sorry, that skipped one, which is interesting in comparison to Marguerite's previous guideline as well. And our recommendation was that in people with aphasia post-stroke, we suggest using either one-to-one or group therapy. And we added the expert consensus statement that the decision on the format of the intervention may be made with reference to the health service context and resources available. We felt that this was these delivery models are a really good way to augment therapy dose and delivery. We also looked at whether one-to-one therapy in addition to group therapy was better than one-to-one SLT alone, and there was just one trial that looked at this aspect. This is the data relating to functional communication and quality of life from that one small trial. We concluded that in people with aphasia post-stroke, the benefits of providing one-to-one plus group speech and language therapy compared to one-to-one speech and language therapy alone are uncertain, and we were then therefore unable to make a recommendation, but we did develop an expert consensus statement which said that in people with aphasia following stroke where access to one-to-one therapy is constrained by resource availability, we suggest that group therapy delivered in addition to one-to-one SLT may facilitate increased therapy time, provide additional opportunities to use language in a social context, and enhance communication confidence. We also suggest that therapy timing and format should follow the other recommendations across the rest of this guideline. In so doing, aiming to enhance language recovery, communication, participation, and quality of life. So, brain stimulation. We focus specifically on transcranial direct current stimulation delivered in addition to SLT versus a sham brain stimulation intervention with the same SLT intervention. While we narrowed it to TDCS alone, there were actually, in fact, 6 different comparisons of brain stimulation, and this was, there were 17 trials across this group. I'm just going to focus on this one, which is left hemisphere anodal transcranial direct current stimulation plus SLT versus sham transcranial TDCS plus SLT. And this is the data as it relates to functional communication, which is no evidence of a difference between the two groups. And there was across this grouping of trials, actually brain stimulation, there was very little measurement of quality of life. We concluded, based on the evidence in this field, that in people with aphasia post-stroke, the benefits of SLT plus transcranial direct current stimulation compared to SLT plus a sham intervention were uncertain, and we weren't really able to make a recommendation. But we did develop a consensus statement where we suggest that in the clinical context, SLT should be delivered alone rather than SLT alongside TDCS. Individualized TDCS protocols for post-stroke aphasia may be beneficial, but we need more evidence, and we make additional recommendations in the manuscript, in the paper, around the research that could be conducted in this field. PICO 7 was looking at aphasia after stroke and tailoring of interventions and whether they were more effective when they were tailored to the individual versus a standard non-tailored approach to speech and language therapy. We found no trials that specifically compared tailored by functional relevance to the individual versus non-tailored approaches. And so we drew on the recent release IPD network meta-analysis that I mentioned earlier, and we found that there were significant gains from baseline on measures of auditory comprehension that were only associated with functionally relevant SLT. There was no evidence of a gain from baseline when SLT was not tailored to the functional relevance of the individual. And for measures of language ability, naming, and functional communication, the gains from baseline were higher when SLT interventions were functionally relevant to the individual than when they were not tailored. So our conclusion, our recommendation there was that in people with aphasia post-stroke, we suggest tailored SLT by functional relevance rather than non-tailored approaches. Very similarly, we looked at tailoring by level of language task difficulty. There was a single trial here, a very small trial. And so again, we drew on the release data, which had very similar findings. And our recommendation was that in people with aphasia post-stroke, we suggest that SLT is individually tailored by level of language task difficulty. So that concludes our PICOs, but we wanted to highlight the areas of future research, because there are many. We want to emphasize the importance of targeting clinically relevant evidence gaps. We definitely need more specific aphasia intervention trials of sufficient size and power that employ the highest quality methodologies, such as the consensus guidelines that we've published on aphasia core outcome set, on the demographic description of participants, and we need more comparisons of different types of SLT interventions. We would like to see more routinely captured follow-up data, ideally up to a year post-stroke intervention and beyond. And another huge area that really needs to be addressed is the development of valid and reliable language and culturally relevant outcome measurements in aphasia for the multilingual population. There's a real dearth of language tools out there, which is probably quite specific to the field of speech and language therapy for aphasia. So, in summary, we are recommending that aphasia rehabilitation should be frequent, at least 4 times weekly, intensive at least 3 hours weekly, at a sufficient dose, so that's at least 20 hours of speech and language therapy. It should be functionally relevant to the person with aphasia, at a sufficient level of language task difficulty, and it made those dose and intensity levels could be augmented by digitally delivered and group-based intervention provision. These are our key recommendations, and that's the QR code for the guideline, which I see is now published. So, thank you.
The floor is now open to questions. We have time for a quick question. If there are no questions, then we move to the next speaker, Diana.
Thank you very much again for the efforts of you, the co-chair, and all the model working group members on synthesizing all this evidence, which again is a very difficult field. And I remind you all that the full guideline is available now at the European Stroke Journal, as well as the previous guideline, which really provides a lot of evidence and can help also everybody with the stakeholders to increase rehabilitation efforts in their own countries. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So now we move to the last of these 3 first guidelines on the topic of life after stroke and rehabilitation.